Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I am exceptionally well, Rory. Glad to be here, and we are so glad that you have joined us for this special edition of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. What we like to do from time to time is bring on a special guest to cover a subject that is maybe of the time. And at the moment, SCoPEd, which is something that has been really spoken about on our Facebook page, is really quite a hot topic. And Rory, you undertook an interview that's going to give us some more information on that.
Yes, I met up with Caroline Jesper, who is Head of Professional Standards at the BACP. She's previously worked as a BACP accreditation assessor and as a professional standards development facilitator. And she was also a senior lecturer for many years, developing and delivering counselling and supervision training. And Jens Bakewell, who's an ecotherapist, supervisor and counselling trainer, and works part-time with the accreditation team, assessing applications for accreditation. And we spoke to both Caroline and Jens about SCoPEd, and this is what they had to say.
Since the recording of this insert, the BACP have issued the following statement, clarifying the reference made in this podcast to counselling and psychotherapy being considered high risk by the PSA. The statement reads as follows. The PSA has not yet conducted a risk assessment of their accredited professionals, and we would like to apologise for the error in communication. What we intended to convey was that the PSA are publicly committed to taking a risk assessment approach, and that looking at the current list of voluntary accredited registers, open brackets, not statutory regulated, close brackets, it is quite possible that the counselling and psychotherapy would be seen as higher risk when compared to some other occupations. The PSA's approach to risk assessment for statutory and voluntary registers was published in 2016, and you can read more on their website. You can read more about the SCoPEd project on the BACP website by visiting bacp.co.uk.
And we welcome Caroline Jesper and Jens Bakewell, who've really kindly offered to answer questions that were asked in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, and you really should be, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group. If you knock on the door, we're a friendly bunch. We'll let you in, and you'll find thousands of like-minded people in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have qualified counsellors, students, and also a smattering of tutors, all talking about the world of counselling, psychotherapy, theories. It's a really good and supportive group. And the questions that we keep getting asked in the group are about SCoPEd, scope of education. So Caroline and Jens have very kindly come onto the podcast to answer questions that you've put. So welcome. Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast. It's good to see you.
Yeah, and good to see you too, Rory.
Oh, thanks for having us, Rory.
So one of the questions that comes up a lot is why is the BACP not seeking government regulation and instead going down the route of scopes?
Okay, I think I'll answer this one. So many people will know that statutory regulation was previously on the government's agenda back in 2012. And at the time, it was proposed that the Health Professions Council would be the regulatory body. And the direction of travel back then was that the standards for the profession would be imposed upon us. So the professional bodies that were involved in those discussions at the time, they actually didn't reach consensus on the standards for the profession. Then there was a general election and a new government came into power and statutory regulation was dropped. So the professional bodies have come together now to work on the SCoPEd project as a way of organising ourselves so that we are in a strong position to respond to regulation if or when it ever comes back on the table. But it's worth pointing out that statutory regulation is a parliamentary decision. It's not one for the professional bodies. However, SCoPEd is enabling the profession to be prepared if statutory regulation actually returns to the political agenda. So we know that SCoPEd is having a visible impact on the Professional Standards Authority's thinking, that's the PSA. And many of you will know that the PSA have currently undertaken a consultation, and that consultation is giving really positive signals about the need and a desire for a shared standards framework that gives different entry points into the profession. And the PSA is also indicating a move towards what's known as an enhanced regulation model, which would have varying levels of risk. And in that, counselling and psychotherapy are considered high-risk professions by the PSA. So the SCoPEd framework is a really positive step in preparing ourselves for when or if the PSA actually moves in that direction. And their consultation gives us a clear indication that statutory regulation is not currently on the table for the foreseeable future. Now, we know that some of our members are in favour of statutory regulation and some of them aren't. We have lots of members and they all have different views. But if it did come to regulation, the framework would be a really good basis for these conversations. And just to point out that counselling and psychotherapy and also foot care professions, interestingly enough, are the two occupations who have been really proactive in trying to sort their standards out. And the framework allows people to progress and move between the various columns. So it means members aren't stuck at their initial entry point. And I know we're going to cover this aspect in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so there's a sense here that although statutory regulation, and we're talking about the UK here,
Yes,
statutory regulation isn't actually on the table, and you're absolutely correct. Under the Labour government, I think they got quite close to it. The SCoPEd framework would give a framework to support or to work with any future statutory regulation.
Exactly. Yes. So it's forming a really strong foundation so that we're ready for that if it ever comes back.
Now, if we think of Europe, and since Brexit, of course, we are not part of Europe. In Europe, there's been a certificate of psychotherapy, European certificate of psychotherapy, which existed since 1991, and it's got around 120,000 psychotherapists from 41 European countries. The question that was asked was, wouldn't the BACP be better aligning themselves with this European register, and in fact the World Council for Psychotherapy, than going down the route of the SCoPEd project?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say that the European standards were mapped as part of the SCoPEd project. And we know that once we've got a shared framework that's been agreed with all of our partners, it might be possible at that point to begin having those conversations about access to the schemes that you've just mentioned. But whether or not someone can work abroad really actually depends on the regulatory landscape in each of those particular countries. So it's actually quite complex because each European country has its own legislation and standards. So, for example, in France, counselling and psychotherapy is a regulated profession. So we're not actually BACP is not currently part of any of these international or European schemes because we believe that the ability to work abroad is limited by the jurisdiction of individual countries. So we're not clear in what way people think they might be being disadvantaged or isolated, as the person in the question indicates, because we know that we do have international credibility, and we hear this from many training providers abroad, and we do have quite a few international members as well. So we'd be really interested to hear more about people's views on that. But a shared standards framework, so for example, the SCoPEd framework, would actually make it easier for people to apply for the European Certificate of Psychotherapy. And I know there's also questions about UKCP, and we understand that there are alternative routes into UKCP registration as a psychotherapeutic counsellor. And we know that UKCP will consider applications that include a range of other practice requirements in addition to their core training meeting certain requirements, because I understand the person asking the question raised that as well.
Absolutely, and it would seem that it's not as clear cut as that there is one particular standard. That
Yes.
In Europe, different countries indeed do have different regulatory boards, if you like, for counselling and psychotherapy. So perhaps it's not quite as clear cut as the question might have thought.
Exactly, but I guess the SCoPE framework would be a step in the right direction in that respect, in enabling practitioners to work more internationally.
Yes, and of course this is going to be something that's coming up more and more because we're in the world of online therapy now.
Absolutely,
where people can work from any part of the world to any other part of the world that's got a connection.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
So we've had a lot of questions that came in, and we're going to put this under the heading of what does the framework mean for me? We've had students asking about kind of what qualification route they should go on, and we're going to cover that as we go through. Qualified practitioners saying they've been qualified for a number of years and they've spent a lot of money on CPD. And again, what does it mean for them? So I think we can't answer all those questions individually, but what does the framework mean?
So I'm going to talk about this one, Rory. So what SCoPE's done is mapping the existing landscape as to training, and it wants to recognise all of the different entry points that people might have into the profession, the different kind of core trainings that people do. But we also want to look at what happens post-qualification, because of course, we don't stick at kind of where when we've done our core training, we all do CPD, for example, listening to this podcast, reading, conferences, all of the different things that we do. So we do all sorts of different types of post-qualification CPD and training, and then also all the experience that we have in the workplace with our clients. So what SCoPE wants to do is kind of map those existing entry points, and then have kind of different mechanisms for moving between the different SCoPEd columns to recognise all of those different training and experience things that counsellors are doing. As the framework is still in the draft form, we can't comment on exactly how individual circumstances may, how everything's going to fit in, because we're still waiting for the final iteration. And just to say, if you want to feedback on the SCoPEd project, there's lots of mechanisms to do that through our website. So I can't say exactly how I'm going to fit into the SCoPEd framework, or Caroline will, or you will, Rory, or anyone will, until we've got the final framework. But what I would say is there's some case studies on the website as to how we envisage that it's going to work. So I encourage people to go and have a look on there. And what I'd also say is that we really want the framework to be flexible and not restrictive. And I think for me, that's one of the really important things about the SCoPE framework, is that no matter where you enter the profession, where you do your initial core training, you can move through those different columns in order to recognise the different levels of training and experience that you develop as you kind of move through your working life.
Yeah, so I think the key thing here that I'm taking away from this is these are not fixed points. The framework takes into account maybe training, other things that you've done, other areas of training you may have engaged in, but at the moment those points aren't the framework's in draft, so those points haven't been precisely mapped yet. Would that be a good summary?
So I think, as Caroline's mentioned, we've the framework's been in development with various different partners, and we've recently had some new partners come on board, and of course we've been talking to members of the different of obviously BACP and the other membership organisations that we're working together on. So we're still waiting for the results of all of those consultancy work that's been happening before this final framework is going to come out, and I believe we're looking to the autumn this year for the next iteration of the framework to be published.
What we'll do is we will put some links into the podcast page on Counselling Tutor website, so that people who are listening to this can go through and just see how SCoPE's developing and see how the newer iterations of the framework are developing. And we've had a lot of people ask us, accredited colleagues, will all the time and money I spent on my accreditation be wasted? Because at the moment accreditation is seen as the gold standard. What's the response to that, Jens?
Well, that's a lovely thing to hear about the way accreditation is perceived as someone who leads the accreditation team. Absolutely, we would not want all of the hard work people have done on accreditation to be wasted. I remember spending hours writing on my reflective practice things. Yes, it would be heartbreaking to feel that all that time had been wasted. So if you look at the SCoPEd framework, accredited members currently are mapped to column B, and we want people to feel really confident that that's where they sit. And actually, it may be that people might actually sit in column C, if they've done additional training in CPD, if they've done additional experience. So it might be that they sit in column C, and in the future, as well as the mechanisms for accreditation, we're also going to need to have mechanisms to allow people not only to move from column A to column B, but also to move from column B to column C. So we will have that. We will start to develop those mechanisms, and at the moment, of course, we can't do that because we're still waiting for the final version of the framework. But when that does come out, and if SCoPEd does go forward, we'll make sure that those things are in place. Of course, things like accreditation are always a choice. I have many very experienced colleagues who, for a variety of reasons, have chosen not to go down that route. We will still have kind of BACP accreditation and other things like that, but we will also have other mechanisms for people who have decided not to go down those sorts of routes to be able to evidence the kind of training experience and knowledge and competencies that we have. Just to say again, just wanting this framework to be very flexible for people and not restrictive.
Yes, and it seems to me there's a sense of inclusivity here, in that these aren't fixed positions for the columns as such. People may be able to enter them depending on their qualifications, depending on their experience, but this would come out in the final iteration. It's still a work in progress. One of the questions that eternally comes up on our Facebook page is what is the difference between a counsellor and a psychotherapist? Now, I have to say that during my time, I have at a lame attempt of humour put in £40 an hour, but I think it's probably a little bit more different than that. So, what is the difference between counsellor and psychotherapist?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rory, and it's kind of been a bit of a perennial debate in the profession, and I know that you've done a previous podcast about that topic. And of course, we don't just call ourselves counsellors and psychotherapists. I work outdoors and with nature, so I call myself an ecotherapist.
Oh, wow. So
there's all sorts of different titles that people have. I think what I want to say is it's so in the first iteration of the SCoPEd framework, the columns were called counsellor, psychotherapist. We did have these titles in there. For the current iteration of the framework, the titles have been taken out. And I just want to make it really clear that the columns are not about what you can do or what you're allowed to do, because this has been something I've seen people kind of talking about on social media. So it's not about us trying to police what people can or are allowed to do. We're not going to kind of come into your session with a client and say, oh, you shouldn't be doing that because that's in column C. What we've done with the columns is trying to map the current initial core trainings and what in general therapists on these types of trainings have been trained to do. And it aims to show what the shared minimum standards are now. As I said before, all therapists do further CPD and training, whether that's conferences, workshops, reading books and journals, watching documentaries, e-learning, or kind of more formal type classroom education. We all develop in our knowledge and experience through our practice experiences, through our life experience, and as a result, we gain different competencies and new competencies, depths of competencies as we move through our working lives. For example, I bet a lot of us didn't expect to develop so much competencies in working online and by phone. Over the last year with COVID, we've all had to do that. SCoPEd is a recognition of that continual development and professional growth, and we want it to be really enabling and not restrictive. At the same time, as practitioners, we all need to make sure that we're working within our competence levels in line with the ethical framework of BACP or NCS or UKCP, whichever organisation that we belong to. If SCoPEd goes forward, this is going to be exactly the same as it is now. Therapists work within the competencies that they have the training, knowledge and experience to do. We have some of these competencies from our initial training, some from that post-qualification CPD and experience, or even from previous careers or experience before we trained as therapists. So we're not going to be preventing anyone from practicing within their competencies with clients, no matter what column their training fitted into. So, for example, a therapist might sit at column A, but they're very likely to be able to be practicing some of the competencies in column B and column C. The key thing is that therapist knows that they're trained and competent to do those things.
Yes.
So coming back to titles, as I've said, the current iteration doesn't have titles, and we don't distinguish competence based on titles. But when we did the mapping, it did show that there was differentiation between the different initial training courses, and that's what the frameworks tried to show. So titles haven't been decided. They are likely to go back in for the final iteration of the framework. However, all partners need to agree on this. And when the publication in the autumn happens, hopefully decisions will have been made by then. But because we've had some new partners joining the project, it's taken a little bit more time than has been previously envisaged. So part of the reason for SCoPEd in the first place is that there are these different titles and people have very different interpretations of these titles and what they mean. And again, the idea of SCoPEd is to kind of make things clearer for clients, clearer for employers, and clearer for students coming into the profession.
Yeah, it seems like there's a very strong focus on accreditation of prior learning and training within SCoPEd. From what I've heard already, that we talked about different entry points, and this seems to bear out. And I think it's interesting. Counselling and psychotherapist, it's a perennial debate, and I think one that will go on probably forever. A lot of people who work in counselling are absolutely passionate about being in service of the clients, and we've had questions around clients' views, and the question that was asked is, why are clients' views completely absent from any discussion on creating a training and regulatory framework for counselling? And why does no one care about what happens when poorly trained therapists damage clients?
Yeah, well, we do very much care. Everything, all the work that we're doing is in the service of the clients. As many people will know, BACP has a service called the Ask Kathleen service, which is specifically being developed to support clients who have concerns about the therapy that they're receiving. However, as a membership body, we've only got jurisdiction over the therapists that are actually our BACP members, just as the other bodies only have jurisdiction over theirs. We've also got a range of different information sheets, etc., to support clients. But when it comes to training, many clients don't. There are a lot of clients that don't seem to understand what it is that they might look for in a therapist, or what they might be getting from a therapist. So we want clients to have confidence in the therapist that they see. So regardless of whether the therapist sits at column A, B or C, that the client has confidence that the practitioner they're going to be seeing has completed a robust standard of training, which anybody that sits on the framework will have. So the framework isn't necessarily a client-facing framework, because it's focused specifically on core training. And as I've said, it's not always in many clients' knowledge bank, if you like, what the training is. And actually, this is one of the impetus for the project, because there are so many different training routes. It's actually really confusing for members of the public. So one of the aims of the project is around enabling clients to be able to make more informed choices about what type of therapist they might want to work with. We do hope some of the issues raised in this question will be addressed by the SCoPEd project, and also by the Professional Standards Authority consultation, and also regulation if at any point it was to come back on the table. But just to say, in the new governance structure for SCoPEd, we're going to be recruiting 2 experts by experience, which will actually bring in the client's views and voice into the ongoing development of the framework. So, for example, if the SCoPEd framework is implemented, the use of experts by experience will be looking to them for their input to help us to know how best to explain the framework to clients. But there's also another piece of work that sort of runs alongside this. So the National Psychological Professionals Workforce Group have been undertaking some work around service user and carer involvement across core psychological professions training, which we've been involved in that work as well. And that working group is looking at how experts by experience and carers are involved in training across the psychological professions. And the aim of that work is to create a best practice guide for different professions, to give guidance to potential clients and existing clients on how involvement can happen at different levels of training. And this is similar work that sits alongside SCoPEd, which we're involved in, and that work will feed into our work on SCoPEd as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing in this interview is that SCoPEd is a work in progress.
Yeah.
And as that progresses, the BACP is taking views from stakeholders in every area that is connected with counselling and psychotherapy. So and I would echo that ethical bodies do care about about the clients, because it's the reason that we all exist.
Yes, it's our reason for being.
Yes.
And so because the framework is currently, it's mapped what is already in terms of existing core training. So it's I suppose it's a bit sort of further on down the line in the project that we'll be seeking clients' views as to actually, is this going to be something that will help them to make sense out of what they might be looking for in a therapist.
Absolutely. And one of the things that perennially comes up is, of course, people who've spent a huge amount of money on their training, their CPD, their insurance, their membership fees to ethical bodies, about being paid for their work. And one of the questions that was asked was, will any of this help, and by any of this, we talk about the SCoPEd project, help psychotherapists be able to be paid for their working hours? Many insurance companies, referral agents, and EAPs, that's employment assistance programs, only pay for CBT and BACP accredited. Does psychotherapy have no commercial value?
Well, we believe very much that it does. And another one of the visions of the SCoPEd project is actually to enable us to advocate even further for paid work for all qualified and registered therapists. So the framework aims to evidence and show employers and commissioners a really accurate and more informed view of what therapists do, what our members do. So to essentially enforce the need for practitioners to be respected and paid for their work. Of course, different roles that employers are looking to fill seek different types of workers. And at the moment, there's quite a lot of a lack of understanding about what different therapists do. Now, it is our firm belief and that all our qualified and registered counsellors and psychotherapists should be paid for their work. And we have a whole dedicated department in BACP, the policy team, who are continually lobbying and advocating for pay and better value of the work that we do. And any therapist that's qualified and enters the framework at column A, that's equivalent to being a registered member. And of course, that won't change, that they should absolutely be paid for what they're doing. So we hope that the framework will make it much clearer to people about what different practitioners do, and will give us a firmer kind of platform, if you like, for arguing a stronger case for employed paid work for all qualified counsellors and psychotherapists, regardless of which level they're at. But unfortunately, BACP doesn't decide what people are paid, but we do, as I say, do a lot of work to influence employers. And just to kind of reinforce again that we absolutely believe that all qualified therapists should be paid and valued for the work that they do.
Absolutely, and we have spoken on another podcast with one of your colleagues his job is forward facing to employers, and they talk in great depth about the work they're doing to engage employers and that educational aspects. We'll put a link in the page of this podcast so people can listen to that podcast as well. We had a lot of questions coming up about what advice would you have for students who are choosing training options now? So those people who may listen to the podcast and think, I really would love to be a counsellor and help people. And we get a lot of questions asked, which training route shall I go down? So given the SCoPEd project and its scoped, its scope. I'm using scoped in two different ways here. What advice would you have for students who are choosing training options now?
Oh, thanks, Rory. Well, I've been working in counselling training for some years now, involved at colleges and at universities. And I'm saying exactly the same thing to students now as I kind of always have been, really, and would still be saying if SCoPEd didn't exist. I think it's all about finding the right course for you and knowing that there's lots of different options out there. I think there are so many courses, and that's what SCoPEd's trying to do, is to make sense of this landscape and help students who are coming into the profession understand the routes and which courses are relevant to them. In our work with training providers, we've had quite a positive message. Kind of in general, people seem to be quite supportive of some kind of shared framework where they can map their trainings and more easily communicate to students that they're recruiting where it fits into that landscape for potential applicants. I think I want to kind of put a word of warning out there. Unfortunately, there's so many training courses out there, and unfortunately sometimes people take training courses and don't realise that they don't meet the minimum standards for joining excuse me, they don't meet the minimum standards for joining professional bodies like BACP or UKCP or NCS. For example, people might take a training course that doesn't have a placement, and unfortunately, because of the training course not having an assessed placement, it then means that people aren't able to kind of go on to join those membership bodies. So one of the things about SCoPEd, if it goes forward, it will be really clear those minimum entry requirements of that level 4 core training, the supervised placement, the minimum number of tutor contact hours, to make sure that it is a kind of a recognised training that does what it is saying to do. I think more generally, I want to say, depending on kind of where you are with other types of training that you've done in the past, you may want or need to do a level 2 or level 3 training. In addition, you might not want to jump in and do a 2-year qualification straight away. You might want to just dip your toe in the water with sort of an introduction to counselling course, and see if it's for you. It might not be what you think it is. Once you start, you might get a sense that it's not quite right for you. So yes, you might want to do that level 2 or level 3 first. I think having an idea of potentially what type of setting you want to work in, maybe what clients you want to work with, that's kind of important when you're thinking about choosing training. And also, of course, thinking about modality, what aligns with you and your values. I trained as a person-centred practitioner, and some of the students who I've spoken to have been doing trainings before core trainings, like level 2 or level 3, maybe saying, person-centred, it doesn't fit right for me. I prefer something a bit more structured, and kind of feel that that's what clients need. So going on to do core training and person-centred, if that doesn't align with kind of how you see the world and how you feel that problems develop, or how you feel that problems how you feel that people can best be given support, that wouldn't be a good fit. So really have a good think about what modality fits for you. Of course, what's affordable for you is important. In the past, we've said definitely what's geographically viable for you, like where you can travel to. Of course, things are all online at the moment, but fingers crossed, and we'll be able to go back to face-to-face teaching in the future. I'd also say talk to other students about their experiences. Most courses will do things like open days, where you'll have students who've already done the course, so you can talk to them. Going back to that word of warning again, just making sure that the course you choose meets those minimum requirements, that it's fit for purpose, so that you can go on to join a professional body and kind of have those employment opportunities. SCoPEd is a flexible framework, so no matter where you do your kind of core training, so if you enter at that level 4 core training, you will be able to move through the trainings. You don't need to kind of do that kind of column C training route. Kind of initially, you could do that if that felt right for you and that's what you wanted, but you can use the SCoPEd framework for progressing through those different columns and seeing where you want your career to go. And I think for me, that's the key thing. At the moment, people sometimes can get stuck where they kind of initially train, and maybe even have to go back to the beginning of training if they want their careers to go in certain directions. What we're hoping to do with SCoPEd is allow it to be very flexible, people to move through those columns, people to specialise in different things, and really be able to evidence and show the different levels of training and experience and CPD and knowledge and all those competencies that we develop just through the course of our working lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a clear message here for people who are listening. There are lots of courses that say you can be a diploma in counselling in a weekend, or a diploma in counselling by doing purely an online course. And here's the thing is, in the age of COVID, at the time that we are recording, a lot of courses are online. But I think that the differentiator there is that you are not just working online. When you're a course that is had to move online from face to face, you will be doing skills work. You will be attending lectures with a tutor live, and be very, very careful. A word of warning. I know there are lots of courses out there. There's no law against this, that offer all sorts of things in terms of promising that you'll be a qualified counsellor, but at the end of it, really, you are left with a certificate. And you've maybe gathered some knowledge, but absolutely you cannot join an ethical body, and you haven't gained the experience working in placement or through supervision. You're lacking in that area,
and that's a real concern for the clients, isn't it? And of course, in the absence of statutory regulation, we feel that SCoPEd is absolutely the next best thing, because we can use this framework to educate people really about people, to people who are interested in becoming a counsellor, letting the public know, and employers and what have you, about what these standards are. So we hope that will have an impact on these courses that you're talking about, Rory.
Absolutely, and we've always championed courses through recognised awarding bodies or universities where they have that key element of the supervised practice, the working in an agency, and of accruing hours as a student. There's a minimum of around about 100 or 100 hours. Some courses ask for more, but that is a key element. And of course, you can join an ethical body on graduating. Now, there's been a lot of discussion and talk about the members of BACP not being not broadly in support of SCoPEd in its current format. Will the proposal go ahead if this support cannot be gained from BACP members?
Now, we've actually, you can go on our website and actually see the outcomes of our most recent survey, and just to kind of cite some stats at you. The last survey showed that 46% of those people that responded were supportive of the project, 31% were neutral, and 21% were against. So we know that the majority are actually supportive of the aims of the project in itself. But that survey also showed that there's a bit of an equal split between around the support for the current format, as you've mentioned there, Rory. So we've got 34% who are in favour of the current format, 31% are neutral, and 31% are against. So actually, all the figures at the moment are showing in favour of support. But we're continuing to engage with members. We know that some people are not in support of SCoPEd for a number of reasons, and we hope to be able to address some of these concerns in this next phase of the work. So we'd really like to take this opportunity to thank people for the feedback that they've provided so far, but it's an open invitation to continue to give us that feedback. So this next stage of the work will be focusing on addressing the feedback that we've received, and that will all be contributing to developing the next iteration of the framework, and we hope that will address some of the concerns that have been raised. So, for example, we've heard quite a bit of feedback. We've talked about it already today, that SCoPEd, fears about SCoPEd restricting them. And as we've said, that's certainly not the aim of the framework. In fact, the aim is quite the opposite. It's about trying to make things more straightforward and enabling people in their career progression. And another concern that we've heard is that some people fear that SCoPEd might be a way for us to make more money from accreditation, and that's simply not the case. We are actually reviewing accreditation at the present time, and we're looking at the different pathways into accreditation and aligning that to the SCoPEd framework. And we are also exploring how we can make accreditation more accessible in lots of different ways to improve accessibility, but in particular looking at how we can remove some of the financial barriers for people. Yes, so I'm not sure I can agree with this statement that, broadly speaking, people aren't in support of the framework, because that's not what we're hearing.
Yeah, so that as Carl Rogers famously said, the facts are always friendly, and through your statistics and your polling, you would take a different view to the question that's been asked.
Absolutely. And, people can go and look on the website. That we publish the results on the website. We recommend you go and have a look. And of course, as I've said, we'll keep those conversations with members going, and please do get in touch with us if you've any further feedback.
It's interesting because, we talked about, access to training, and one of the number of questions came up about diversity. One being, how is SCoPE showing equality to those with learning difficulties and who want to progress with counselling? And also, are you looking at equality impact demographics of people who train via different routes without funding? It seems like SCoPE may reinforce an existing lack of diversity, as some groups are only able to afford shorter training. So I guess the question there is, some training is very, very expensive, some training is not as expensive, and is there a diversity gap there?
Thanks, Rory. I think that's a really important question, and something that feels really close to my heart. Of course, we want to make sure that there is representation within the profession of people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Because the framework is still in its draft stages, I'm not yet able to say how that's going to work with accreditation, but obviously the accreditation team are kind of keeping an eye on this. So the way it's worked is that the SCoPEd project has been kind of separate to the accreditation team. So we're keeping an eye on what's coming out of SCoPEd and the framework, and thinking about how we're going to have mechanisms for evidencing the progression within the framework. And we want to make sure within my team, of course, that those mechanisms are accessible, and also that's commitment kind of at the SCoPEd project level as well. Everyone involved in the SCoPEd project and all the partners are involved, want to make sure that those mechanisms for evidencing progression are accessible. But at the moment, as we've not fully developed those, I can't say exactly what we are, but we'll want to work together collaboratively to agree on how these will look. In terms of the second question that you asked, the general impact assessment, yes, that is going to happen. It's something that's going to need to be agreed again by the partners, by the SCoPEd Oversight Committee, and that is in discussion at the moment. It's something that's very much come up in a lot of the feedback that's happened into the SCoPEd project, a lot of concerns about that. So it's very much on the radar of the SCoPEd team, as well as my team, the accreditation team. But until we know exactly what the framework is going to look like until it's finalised, it's hard to address that. But I can say that there will be an impact assessment in some form once that's been agreed by the SCoPEd Oversight Committee. And going back to the question, again, I just want to reiterate that at the moment, with the column C trainings, if you'd done a column A training, you couldn't progress to column B and then to column C. You'd have to completely restart from the beginning of your training to do a column C training. And what the SCoPEd framework is going to do is to allow therapists to move between column A, column B and column C if they want to. There's going to be different ways to do that and different routes. Hopefully it means that no matter what training someone has chosen at the beginning, what level of training, how expensive that training has been, as long as it meets those minimum standards for the column A training, people can then move through the profession and through the frameworks and evidence and the different knowledge and competency levels. I think I want to say that unfortunately these issues about diversity, are there kind of regardless of scope. There's a mapping of what exists at the moment, what is already out there, and what hopefully, one of the aims of what we want to do is to make sure that it is more possible to be flexible and progress through and evidence those different competency levels, no matter where you started with your core training.
Yes, and I think again it speaks to the SCoPEd project being a work in progress, and at some points some intercept points, there's going to be an impact assessment, and that's going to feed into the final iteration. You talk about the different columns, and this been talked about in the interview. We will put a link into the show notes page of all the different columns. But very quickly, Jens, could you just give us a little overview of what the columns are in terms of competencies, just a general flavour of them, if that's at all possible? But we will put a detailed link into the show notes.
I think that's kind of quite tricky to do because there's kind of quite a lot of competencies, and I don't kind of carry them all around in my head, I'm afraid. I think go and have a look at the framework. But I want to say that this very much kind of maps kind of what different training courses are kind of training people to do and assessing that people do. But it doesn't mean that that's all that you can do or all that you're allowed to do, if that makes sense.
It is, and what we'll do is we'll put a link into the show notes so people can have people who maybe not quite sure what A, B, and C is, they will have a wider understanding of what that is. We'd have a lot of people coming to us who have no formal qualifications, and one interesting question that came through was, where would someone stand in the SCoPEd system with no formal qualifications but have a wealth of experience, such as a drug counsellor that's been through the life experiences themselves and are now living to help others?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because aside from drug counsellors, I think that there's other professions that also use the term counsellor, such as career counsellors. And I guess this sort of widespread use of the term counsellor also adds to the confusion about what a counsellor actually is and what the training is. But to come back to the question that you've asked, if the SCoPE framework is adopted and if the PSA move towards an enhanced regulation model, as I was talking about earlier, and that has some kind of shared standards across the counselling and psychotherapy bodies, then this actually will make it more difficult for people who don't meet those standards to call themselves a counsellor. So although granted it won't be a protected title enshrined in law, which is what statutory regulation would do, but it just simply because the public and employers will be more informed about what a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist is. So as we've been saying, column A in the SCoPE framework actually maps to our existing registered members category. So if you're not entitled to be a registered member or BACP or of any other of the membership bodies, so that being equivalent to SCoPEd A within the framework, then of course you wouldn't sit within the SCoPE framework. It's not to say that other experience isn't important. So in the example in the question around drugs counsellors, but the project is about formally agreeing minimum standards in core training and the evidence that is needed for that.
Absolutely, Caroline. And I would say, as someone who's trained counsellors for many years, I've trained many people from the recovery community who have supported people going through difficulties of addiction and are supporting them. And I've trained many through a traditional counselling route. Some of them have gone on to become qualified colleagues and have gone back into the system as qualified colleagues, offering support to people in addiction. So it seems to me that the framework doesn't really alter anything there. If you want to come into the profession, you have to change. You have to train.
Absolutely, yeah. And so people working in different areas and calling themselves counsellors, of course, there's going to be no law that says they can't call themselves a counsellor, but if they don't sit on the framework, that it might be more difficult for them to do that.
Yes, it might be a bit more difficult for them to justify their title. Yes, absolutely. And as you say, in the absence of regulatory legislation, it's not a protected title. So I suspect that might be a difficulty that goes on for some time.
Yeah, but as you say, Rory, sorry, just say that's not to undervalue the work that they'll be doing. Really, really important and valuable work.
Yes, and also I think sometimes that lives in how the people being helped see the person who's helping them. I think sometimes the counsellor can be a shorthand for helper in general in maybe the eyes of the public.
Exactly. And you'll hear a lot of people that maybe they're seen as some kind of support worker or whatever, and they'll say, I'm going to see my counsellor, you know.
Absolutely. You know, I always believe that, you know, the profession is kind of supported by newly qualified counsellors. They are to some extent the lifeblood of the profession as people retire or move into different areas of work. The newly qualified colleagues, or those who are just graduating from first trainings, are those people who come into the world and fill those gaps, if you like. And we had a question from someone who's a newly qualified level 4 diploma in therapeutic counsellor. So congratulations to you. If this is your question, congratulations to you. What a wonderful thing to have gone through the training and have qualified. And there's a question about how can you reassure me I can continue to work with adults and children through agencies and in private practice? How might SCoPE limit my future work, and how can any limitations be considered fair?
Yeah, well, I'm hoping that what we've talked about so far in the podcast will have reassured this person that there aren't going to be any kind of limitations. But it's what I need to point out is that the SCoPE framework only actually relates to work with adults. Although we've got a new partner, the Association of Child Psychotherapists, the BACP, have recently joined the project, but they've joined the project because their therapists work with clients aged 18 to 25, so that they've joined it from that kind of tranche, if you like, cohort of their client groups that they work with from that perspective. So nothing's going to change regarding work with children and young people. As with all of our work, we work within the limits of our competence, as they do now, and it will be the same if SCoPE's adopted. So, and as we know, working with children and young people requires additional knowledge and skills that's not usually covered in adult focused core training. So our advice to anybody that's done adult focused training, if they want to work with children and young people, or if they do so already, is to go and have a look at our competence framework for working with clients aged 4 to 18, and to map their existing competence. And by doing that, it will help you to identify any gaps that you might have in your knowledge or skills. So it can help you kind of pick up on what kind of further training needs you might have. As I say, this is the same position as it is now. SCoPE will not have any bearing on this. So as long as you are competent to work with adults and or children and young people, SCoPE's not going to have any bearing on this. So children and young people might be an area that we can expand on later. But of course, we've already completed a very significant piece of work on this, as I've mentioned, the evidence-based CYP competence framework. So SCoPE is not intended in any way to be restrictive or limiting. If you've got a level 4 qualification and it meets our registered member status for BACP, then you will sit within the framework at column A. So the framework showcases the extent of what you will have accomplished as a minimum within your core training, and as Jens has been explaining so clearly, how you might move forward as you progress in your career.
Well, I think on that final note, we'll bring the podcast to an end. Before we go, I wonder, Caroline and Jens, what you hope people may have learned from our time together.
So I think for me, I've quite a new member of staff at BACP, and when I first heard about SCoPEd, all those months ago, I remember looking at it and having some concerns about, was this going to restrict things in the profession around things around diversity and things around different modalities being valued. Were people going to have to do lots of different expensive trainings? Was I going to have to do more expensive training to practice in the way I wanted to? And I think that's kind of what I want to kind of reassure people about. The framework's really aimed at being kind of flexible and not restrictive, allowing people, no matter where they do their initial training, to be able to evidence the different competencies that they have then learned through and developed through different CPD, through workplace experience, through practice experience, through supervision, through life experience, like all the different ways that we gain competencies. So it's not about restricting anybody, it's not about policing anyone's practice, it's about different ways of mapping those competencies and that knowledge that we develop throughout our working lives. And as I've said before, my work with the accreditation team, we're going to be making sure that there are these different mechanisms for evidencing those things, and those will be as accessible as possible, whether that's to do with financial ways or kind of other barriers. We want to make sure that as many people as possible, whoever wants to, will be able to go through accreditation, go through all the other mechanisms that we're still in developing to evidence their competencies.
Yeah, and I'd absolutely echo everything that Jens has said there. I think what I really hope people have gained from this podcast is perhaps a bit of clarity and reassurance, really, like Jens, as a practitioner myself. I think my initial response when I first ever saw the very first iteration of SCoPEd was like, oh, what's this going to mean for me? And does it mean it's going to stop me being able to work in certain ways that I already do? And, we've seen that kind of reaction borne out in some of the responses. So we really, really hope that this podcast has given you all some reassurance that SCoPEd is definitely not about being restrictive. It's about enabling you. It's about us as a profession organising ourselves, and it's about having mapped what already is out there. And of course, what already isn't perfect, and I think we all know that. So we hope that the SCoPEd framework moving forward is going to have a really positive influence on the training. Of course, we all aspire, don't we, to for best practice. I think that, and that's coming back to the question before about clients. Absolutely, clients is at the heart of everything that all of us are doing, and that is at the heart of this project as well.
And I think, Caroline, definitely what's out there isn't perfect, and of course SCoPEd hasn't been perfect, and it still isn't perfect, and that's why we want more of your feedback on that. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate again that through the web links that I know Rory's going to put up, you'll be able to not only kind of see the full framework, the full draft of the framework that's there at the moment, but also find out more about how you can feed in and give that feedback if you haven't done that already. So hopefully working together with you, with all the partners that have been part of the project, and the other partners that have more recently joined us, we'll come out with something that maybe looks a bit different to how it's looked before, and see where we can go. And as Caroline says, it just feels so important that for clients and for students and for employers, that we have these professional standards that show what people are trained and competent to do.
Well, thank you so much for those final words. It reminds us that everything we do as counsellors or psychotherapists or helpers in general is in the service of clients. So Caroline, Jesper and Jens Bakewell, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.